This is, sadly enough, at least sadly enough for me, the last lecture about the Greeks. I need another 10 or 20 lectures, but no such luck. Or maybe for you, it's actually good. We will be done with those long dead white Greeks. But it is sad. We're going to depart from a very great civilization, which is the foundation of most things we have, with just a brief glimpse. And this last lecture, I have to tell you about non-literary, non-erotic, if you like, heritage, because we ended up on a very high note last time talking about love. Now we'll have to talk about boring stuff, like how do crabs reproduce. It's love of some kind, but not the love which we were talking about during the last lecture. So the person who changed gears, who somehow moved from a highly intense, very beautiful prose of Plato, which was based on poetical language of Homer and Greek lyric poets and Greek tragedy, we're going to move to Aristotle. When you read Plato, every translator remarks that it's impossible to bring into English, Russian, whatever other language, the beauty of Plato's Greek. He is indeed a master of prose. However, when we talk about Aristotle, the editor of the revised version of complete works of Aristotle, right here, Jonathan Barnes, writes that this is a revised version of a great Oxford translation, which was done by Ross and was effectively done by Victorian people. And he said that the English of the translation is much more beautiful than the original Greek. That is, Aristotle is not a great example of prose writing. Moreover, it's not even clear if any of his books, and we have a lot, as you could see, this is a very sort of small font, large page size. The original edition was like so. It's not even clear if he wrote any of these books, because you see he was a professor. He lectured, and then students made the notes public. They're probably lecture notes edited by him, because when we compare, we have for some of his courses, for his course on ethics, for example, we have 3 different transcriptions, quite dramatically different. And one of them is clearly more authorized. Much later, during Middle Ages, people came up with a sort of a definition of how you publish notes. There was a notion of reportatio, when you just write down, show it to me, I say, yeah, sort of write, publish it. So it's basically your words people are, the moment I mention Middle Ages, they start running away. Reportatio was when you just allow a student to publish lecture notes. And there was a notion of ordinatio, lecture notes which were heavily edited by the professor, nevertheless written by students. So I think something similar happens in case of Aristotle. We have some of the lecture notes more edited, some lecture notes less edited. In some sense, he started modern educational system. And it's not an accident that well into the 18th and 19th century, universities use some of these texts as the standard textbooks. Which is pretty amazing if you think about it. He wrote them, in the 4th century. He died in 322 BC, long time ago. Lots of this stuff remained as the standard text for many centuries. This is, as it were, the first complete encyclopedia of human knowledge. Some of his lectures are amazingly relevant even today, while some of his logical works, and he wrote a very large number of logical works, their totality is known as organon. So many of his logical works are still very relevant and not yet superseded by mathematical logic. So there's still lots of stuff you could extract from it. If I were doing something related to natural language understanding, some of you might be doing things like that, or if I were doing something related to knowledge classification. I know some people who do that. And I would seriously suggest looking at a little book by Aristotle, which is extremely important, called Categories, which is still, while being of fundamental nature, never was absorbed into the modern, more mathematical, or if you like, more computer science system. These are just hints for some of you. So his logical works are pretty amazing. He used a lot of this stuff to build other things. For example, he wrote an extremely complete set of different lecture notes on animals. Sort of, how good are they? Well, let me quote a certain authority in the field, Charles Darwin. So Charles Darwin wrote that while, of course, his work is based on such greats as Linnaeus and Buffon, two sort of people who worked on classification of animals, compare with Aristotle, they are but children. Right? So in many respects, he came up with an idea of classifying animals. He sent his disciples all over the world. He had some powerful disciples who went all over the world. Alexander was one of them, to get many specimens. He started documenting many of zoological facts, and people still discover that they have been dismissed for centuries, recent centuries. People saying, oh, this is nonsense. This couldn't possibly happen. People discover, yes, he was right. So this is very enormous. I mean, think about it. In the same lifetime, to span things from logic to zoology, to classify animals, and to figure out the laws of thought. But it's not all things he did. He also worked on physics. There are some profound ideas in his physics, but of course there is one deficiency which we'll find. He is not mathematical. One of the major departure from his teacher was Plato. And Plato viewed knowledge as fundamentally mathematical. So the studies in Plato's academy was centered on mathematics. Again, the sign on the gates of academy was the one who doesn't know geometry should not enter here. So you had to go through many years, 7 years probably, of very serious mathematical studies before you were allowed to talk about things like politics. I think that Aristotle's opinion was that that was an exaggeration. People could start working on politics after, 1 semester. Better than now. But sort of his more pragmatic approach, again, the breadth was very important. And however, his physics and many of other things which he did were somewhat limited, and eventually, as we shall see, caused even some stagnation because they were not mathematical. Right? Sort of mathematics belongs to the academy. We will come back to it a little later. So he studied constitutions of different Greek states. Sadly enough, most of the works on that are lost, sort of. He wanted to define constitution of every state. We fortunately discovered a long-lost papyrus copy in 19th century of Athenian constitution, the work which was not basically known since the 4th century. It was sort of lost someplace, but it was recovered, so we have an example, but most of the constitutions are lost, irretrievable sort of loss for political history, because Greeks were the greatest experimenters in terms of politics. The number of different political and economic experiments which they did far exceeds anything which was done since then, because sort of we're still not even exploring the space which they defined. Meteorology, the study of weather, the ethics, metaphysics, all of these things, he was the first. Sort of in some sense, most of the things which we know now, we might know different facts, we might know different laws, but the fundamental taxonomy of knowledge, the fundamental structure of a modern university, when we look at the departments, it's pretty much the one he defined, which is utterly amazing. Now, I have to come to a difficult question, sort of, should you read Aristotle? And if you do, what? I said that if you want to understand natural language, look at the categories, look at other works in Organon. But most of his works are hard. If you are to read this, again, any recommendation like that is controversial, because out of a huge body of works, I'm going to pick a small number. If you are to read, I would recommend 2 books, but I do not recommend them for most people. So if you insist that you want to read Aristotle, the first book which you read is Nicomachean Ethics. This is his lectures on ethics. Many beautiful things. I'll talk a little bit about it. The second book, which I will recommend, which is again very fundamental, it's the first book. Till very recently, it was considered to be the necessary book in any course on political science. That's a book called Politics. Of course, I would not recommend most of his books on natural sciences, because they are mostly of historic interest. So these are 2 books. Let me give you some idea. Sadly enough, most of modern opinions on Aristotle are based on sort of mass media or political propaganda. Some of you might know that Aristotle is the founding philosopher of objectivism. Ayn Rand, great American philosopher, last century Ayn Rand. Some people suggest to put her on a $10 bill, and she indeed qualifies. If it's about money, her face should be there. But I have strong doubts that she ever read any Aristotle. Objectivists, sort of in general, tend to propagate all kind of strange myths. I have a very good friend of mine who is an objectivist, well-educated, both undergraduate from very prestigious Ivy League and PhD from very prestigious non-Ivy League junior university around here. When we met, I observed that his computer, remember computers used to have names. And his computer name was Aristotle. So I was delighted. You know, finally in this engineering company, whatever company I worked on, there is a person who names his computer after a great Greek philosopher, Aristotle. So I say, Bob, his name is not Bob, but I say, Bob, which is your favorite book by Aristotle? And he said, what do you mean? Christians burned all his books. I sort of say, well, it might not be the case. We'll talk about Christians and Aristotle in a sense. Most of his books are excellent. He did not believe me. So the next time he had birthday, he invited me. I had to bring these complete works of Aristotle as a present to demonstrate that maybe not all his works were burned. So we continued the discussion, and he said, well, but obviously Christians never, ever read him. I said, well, I mean, I don't know about that, but, you know, most Christian universities since about 13th century were fundamentally Aristotelian schools. At that point, his wife, another well-educated person, said, these were Jesuits, because the idea is that only Jesuits could do some evil thing like that, appropriate an objectivist philosopher and sort of do the Jesuitical things. Well, believe it or not, Jesuits had nothing to do with that. They did not exist in 13th century. And when they appeared, they actually tried to develop an educational system based on classics, things like reading Homer, not reading Aristotle. They were champions of a new curriculum. So I don't think they ever believed me. And all my attempts to show them, but look, there is this Thomas Aquinas commentary on Nicomachean Ethics, which is yay big. Some people would say, well, but you know what they did? They baptized Aristotle. There's a very, very common thing that what Aquinas, Thomas Aquinas, 13th century, Dominican, he baptized Aristotle. If you want, I mean, I'm not expecting you to do that, but if you are going to read his commentaries on Nicomachean Ethics, which are massive, there is absolutely no Christian influence whatsoever. He's commenting on the Greek text of the 4th century as carefully as he can. So he's much less contemporary than I am. I always try to, see, I'm lecturing on Aristotle and talking about Ayn Rand, and that's my evil ways. So in any case, we are dealing with right now a major misunderstanding of Aristotle. So let us look at what he said. Let us pick a couple of themes where Aristotle sort of interacts with objectivism. The idea is that money is the universal good. Well, in the beginning of Nicomachean Ethics, he dismisses the idea that happiness, the ultimate goal of ethics, is to figure out what makes people happy. according to Aristotle. But he says, well, it's clearly not money, because, it's just, even things don't give you happiness. And money is just something which leads to things. It could be a car. It is not. But money is not even a car. It's this abstraction. So he dismisses it as a totally crazy idea. Somewhere he actually equates hedge fund managers and bankers and other people like that with procurers. You know what procurers are? People who procure prostitutes. He sort of thinks that these are moral equivalent. Pimps. You might have heard the term, pimps. Okay? So he thinks it's like pimping. I'm not saying he's right. What I'm saying, that's what he thinks. At the end of Nicomachean Ethics, he talks about what actually makes you happy. And he says it's contemplation. Sort of thinking about the eternal truths and beauties, things like that. And he actually uses this word, which I know I'm not supposed to use, God. He thinks that contemplating God is the universal end of mankind. What a strange idea. But it is Aristotle. Of course, objectivists, they are denying any such eternal things. Now, let us look at his politics. In his politics, he, and again, objectivists love this passage. He says that, of course, private property is good for managing the estates, for assuring that things are effectively produced. Well, of course, they don't want to read the next sentence. The next sentence says, but when we distribute the goods, we should share them. The universal sharing of the distribution. Again, for him, this is not some theoretical idea of the future society. This is something they do at Sparta and Crete. He is certain that the idea that goods should be distributed equally among everyone is the right thing. He criticizes Spartans that instead of universal taxation and then sort of providing goods for these groups of friends who come together to eat together, Spartan used the system where a member of the group sort of gives some money to the group. And that creates certain inequality. For example, if in my group there will be, Jeff Bezos will get better food. Okay, I'm not going to mention local management, Mark Zuckerberg. But he also, of course, bases this idea on his experience in Athens. He is not an Athenian. He just moved to Athens, but of course, he is very, very impressed with the idea that all the cultural goods, not just food, are freely distributed. Remember, people are paid to attend great tragedies by, say, Euripides. Everybody. And the obligation of a rich person is to stage this. Rich people, to be accepted by society, compete, truly compete, to make this culture accessible to everyone. So, I'm saying, Ayn Rand will have to reconcile her idea of strong capitalist with what Aristotle suggests. Again, both of these books address the issues of just society. They are good books, but they are difficult. No stories. Right? So I'm just warning you. If you make a commitment to that, since many of you have problems with reading Homer, with lots of fun and people sticking swords and spears into each other, that is much harder. Start with Homer. I'm not denying greatness of Aristotle, and I do read him myself, but again, it's a major undertaking. Now, I have to do something totally impossible. I have 15 minutes, roughly, to tell you about the rest of Greek science. And I have to do it because if you are to read Greek non-literary text, Aristotle is not going to be my primary choice. Many of you know who is going to be my primary choice. He is this obscure person called Euclid. Again, why do I say so? Again, I repeat, this is one of the fundamental points of this course. I want you to understand people like Jefferson and Lincoln. I have absolutely no doubt that Lincoln never read Aristotle. I have absolute certainty, 100% certainty, that he read Euclid many times and acquired a fluency in his first 6 books. Well, he was a president. More than the rest of the recent presidents. Jefferson was, of course, absolutely. He and Adams knew Euclid very well. Modern presidents, they do fuzzy math. They invented such method, Berkeley. I'm not joking. Yeah, exactly. Great man. So let's ignore it. So Greeks produced enormous amount of great science, not just philosophical science, like in Aristotle, but mathematical science. It starts with Euclid, which is the greatest, the only book which allows you to develop mathematical deductive ability, starting from axioms, coming with very advanced results. It's a great book because it has a plan. It's not just a collection of random theorems. Euclid would not put a theorem in the book unless it's needed for the final goal, where the final goal is classification of Platonic solids. Don't forget, he's the result of the Platonic Academy. So the great classificational results that there are only 5 regular polyhedra, solid bodies which are, well, being precise, convex and have equal faces. There are only 5 such. So, and they're all constructible with ruler and compass, by the way. So he proves there is this enormous path to which shows you how to get from the first principle to really complicated existence theorem, which says that only 5 exist, no more, no less. It's, astonishing result. It's, of course, nobody knows, you could ask most modern mathematicians, how does Euclid end? Everybody knows how it starts. So with axioms, but nobody knows how it ends. So it's a good thing to know. For most of you, getting to the end would be impossible. But as old Greek teachers sort of insisted, any educated Greek should be able to prove any theorem from the first book out of 13. So at least try to work through that. It ends with this great result called Pythagorean Theorem. And of course, the proof of Pythagorean Theorem in Euclid, it's not just beautiful, it's much more profound than what you learned at schools. At schools, they taught you something about, if you take square of this, you take square of that, add them together, it will come. Well, Euclid knows nothing about squares. He doesn't square numbers. Well, he knows square as a shape. So what he shows is that you could cut the square on the hypotenuse in such way that one part will be equal to square on this one, and another one will be equal to the square. So he gives a constructive, not just proof, but constructive algorithm for partitioning the larger square into two pieces. So with area, again, he doesn't have your notion of an area. I mean, he has a much more subtle notion of two figures having equal area for him. What it means is that you to cut one so that you could assemble the other out of the, it's literally very constructive approach, wonderful stuff. Read Euclid. The first book of Euclid is something which everyone, whether he is a programmer or not a programmer, should read. The edition which I recommend is, of course, first volume of a 3-volume edition by Sir Thomas Heath, a great English historian of mathematics, with extensive commentaries. It's a beautiful edition. Will cost you $12.95 on Amazon. Now, but that was not all. There are remarkable other mathematical books, which sadly enough, it's probably too late for you to read. There is a great work by Apollonius of Perga on conic sections. You see, it was so great that it led to a remarkable work by Kepler on the movements of the planets. First, of course, Kepler decided to follow Plato and build the trajectories of the planets on Platonic bodies inscribed into each other. When he realized that facts don't quite fit into the scheme, he said, what other great Platonic mathematics could I use? And it's either circles, which come from Euclid, or the next step, which is Apollonius, where you deal with conic sections, with things like ellipse or parabola, which do describe the trajectories of heavenly bodies. And that led to Newton, and you know the history, a great work. If you want to see something which in terms of beauty and precision sort of surpasses in reality any modern text on calculus, read Archimedes. Of course, you know that there was this guy who ran naked in Syracuse. Maybe he did, maybe he didn't. That we don't know for sure. What we do know for sure is he wrote some remarkable mathematics which is extant and easily accessible. And in many respects, it was this mathematics to which Newton referred when he said, we're standing on the shoulders of giants. Right? These are the shoulders of giants he was talking about, specifically Archimedes. Sort of the step from Archimedes to modern calculus of Newton is infinitesimal. The pun is intended. So he could do very sophisticated integration and show that rigorously. Of course, there is a remarkable book which many of you should at least take a look, called On Method, where he explains how you get mathematical results. Because you, of course, all think that you should get them from axioms. And then you contemplate things and derive the good results. And Archimedes, being one of the greatest mathematicians of all times, clearly among top 3 or 5, very, very high, says, no, it's not how you do. You cheat. How do you cheat? He tells you how one of the greatest results in the history of mathematics is his result on the volume of the sphere, a ball. And he was so proud of it that he, in his will, he asked this construction, which shows the volume of the sphere, to be inscribed on his tombstone. And this is, till today, the most famous tombstone. There's a wonderful story in Cicero who talks about how, when he came to Syracuse as a governor, he asked, where is the tomb of Archimedes? And they said, oh, we don't know. It's long lost. So he found it because there was this picture on the tomb. And then he says that, of course, Greeks loved mathematics, but we Romans, we just love practical things like money. So he was a bit critical of the Roman ways. We'll talk about the Roman ways the next time. So Archimedes was a great man, and he said how you get the result, and his result, was that the volume of a sphere is 2/3 of the volume of the cylinder into which the sphere is inscribed. You have to do integration to do that. He said, nah, never mind integration. You start with experiments. What do? You make a ball, you make a cylindrical thing, you pour water, you stick the ball in, you see how much water is left. Oh, approximately 2/3. Now you know what to prove. Right? So he's a very, very honest guy in that regard. And after that, by the way, he does everything by the book. It's all like rigorous and beautiful. But he says, no, but it's not how you obtain the results. You have to cheat. You have to use experiments. You look, you do physics, if you like, to get math. Wonderful stuff. So this work, it's fairly famous on method because it was recently discovered. It's another case of a long-lost book, which was discovered at the end of the 19th century. And the story there was a good thing on Nova, public television, which describes sort of the discovery of the text and the recent work on its reconstruction. It doesn't really talk about the text. It talks about all around. This is the problem with many of the science things. They talk all about, running naked and who had what kind of haircut. Because what do you know about Einstein? That he looked almost like me, or I looked almost like he never, cut his hair and maybe never washed, whatever. But these are not central things in relativity theory. So Archimedes is very important. Then there is a name which right now is very maligned, but nevertheless an astonishing name which everybody needs to venerate is Ptolemaeus, the sort of discoverer of scientific astronomy, the man who came up with a mathematical model which explains the movement of planets. And you say, well, but we have a better one. Well, it took us a long time to get a better one. And by the way, Copernicus didn't get a better one. I mean, Copernicus was sort of right, except his mathematics didn't work. If you assume the circular motion, nothing works. Ptolemaic system was a much better predictor. It took a great work by Kepler, to get to a mathematically correct, better model, which again was using Greek math. So, great work by Ptolemaeus. There were wonderful treatises on mechanics. In many respects, the level of science Greeks reached during the Hellenistic times after Aristotle, or more importantly, time after Alexander. Alexander died 1 year before Aristotle, 323, a very important date. So after that starts this period of Hellenistic civilization, where Greek spreads throughout the world, and during the first, say, 100, 150 years after that, the scientific accomplishments are astonishing. We caught up with them maybe by 19th century. These were not just scientific accomplishments. We have to understand that they had, as we know now, remarkable practical abilities. One of the great discoveries in the early 20th century, people discovered this strange relic known as Antikythera Mechanism. And people couldn't figure out what it was. Just a bunch of wheels. Then they figured out what it was. It took many, many years. But right now there is a scholarly consensus that there was a machine which could predict the position of planets by just crank the wheel, and it shows where they are. Not bad. What is the most significant thing about it, however, is not astronomical knowledge. We knew Greeks knew astronomy. That's not new. What is astonishing are the wheelworks. The fact that they will fabricate the gears is astonishing. They were doing things which were probably not doable prior to the end of 18th, the beginning of 19th century, in terms of just producing this thing. It was lost. You know, the new masters came who said, we don't want any of these wheels, we want big guns. These were Romans. And lots of stuff disappeared. Some of it we will never find out. Because one of the things you have to understand, that the texts which we have are undergraduate texts. Obviously, the advanced stuff existed with very, very few copies, maybe one or two, because there are one or two people who could understand that. So none of that, none of the real research work is left. Right? So when we have Euclid, that was the elementary textbook. Every child was supposed to work through it, and did. When we get Archimedes, wonderful mathematics and very advanced even by today's standard, but he is a special case. You see, he was one of the few mathematicians who could write beautiful prose. These are just, Euclid doesn't, Archimedes does. So he was boasting. Very often he would write this book, sort of basically saying, I could explain these complicated ideas to total idiots, or people like us. So he was writing these books just to show off, very successfully. So there is this great heritage which we had. A lot of it we lost. The message of it, the message of, partial message of the summary of the class is there are wonderful things which are left, but there are also wonderful things, unbelievable things which were lost. Civilization could decline, do usually decline. There was a civilization, in many respects, the greatest civilization ever produced, the one by Greeks. And what we have just a shattering remains. Right? We're still living on the crumbs from their table. Right? A lot of what we have are these little bits and pieces which we try to make sense out of. This is why we have to protect what we have. This is why, instead of reading you know whom, you should read good books. One who must not be named. Some of you might understand the reference. So, okay.